We have this incredibly bloated financial sector. It's a phony crisis. They don't have to be cuts. We know how to get out of a Great Depression. You spend money. If we take a look at the typical worker, they're not doing fine.
Hi, I'm Dean Baker. I'm your host for Mostly Economics. We have with us here today Sasha Abramsky, who's a freelance writer, reporter, an author of numerous books and articles. And the reason we have him joining us here today is he has a forthcoming book, American Carnage, which is about how the federal workforce was attacked, I think is probably a fair word here, by Elon Musk, DOGE, and the Trump administration, and includes interviews with many of the federal workers, or I should say some of the federal workers who had seen their lives uprooted by these attacks. So thanks for joining us, Sasha.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be on. Thank you for having me.
So let me just start with the big question. You decided to write a book, talk to a lot of people, look into this a bit. What was it that prompted you to do this?
Well, I write for The Nation magazine on a regular basis. I'm a columnist, I'm a feature writer. And the genesis for the book actually came out of reporting that I started doing in January, shortly after the inauguration, when it became very, very clear that not only was Trump going to downsize the federal government, but he was going to do so in the most spectacularly coercive and sort of almost violent of ways, that he was going to turn hundreds of thousands of federal workers into what he was calling the enemy from within. And this to me was extraordinary, that you could take people who had built careers in the public sector and they were doing good work. They were working in public health care. They were working on consumer protection. They were working on environmental issues. They were doing it for all the right reasons. And suddenly there was an administration that was in power that was accusing them essentially of being traitors, of abusing the public trough. And to me, this was fascinating. I've written about politics for 30, 35 years, but I've never encountered, even at the sort of height of the neoliberal reaction against big government, I'd never encountered a rhetoric that was so dangerous and so violent against individual federal workers. And I'd never seen a sort of episode where men as powerful as Donald Trump or Elon Musk were using their vast public platforms to denigrate individuals, to mock individuals, to target individuals. And to me, this represented something new in American politics, something new, something deeply disturbing. And it seemed to me that if I could get in on this story early, if I could find federal workers who were willing to talk to me, if I could find the stories of government agencies that were being dismantled at speed, of entire sectors of the public sector that were literally being frog-marched out of their offices by armed US Marshals, if I could tell that story over several months, I would be telling the story of what America in the year 2025 under Donald Trump was coming to look like. And to me, that was a story that was vitally important. So that's why I jumped into it.
It is striking, again, I totally agree with the points you're making here. And I'll confess I have sympathy for government workers, a couple of reasons. Obviously, I've had a lot of occasion to be encountered with them, particularly I'm an economist, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, other statistical agency. I talk to them a lot, I always found them very useful, very helpful. But also, my mother spent her career working for the Illinois Department of Public Aid. So it's not a federal employee, but she's a government bureaucrat, if you like, So I'm sympathetic to, having been raised by one, I'm sympathetic to these people. But what's striking, and again, just to emphasize your point, there's this idea of massive government waste, which is hugely exaggerated, but it's big agency, big organization. There's waste, pick your, let's go to Elon Musk. I'm sure we'd find plenty of waste in Tesla. We could find plenty of waste in Microsoft. Big organizations have some waste. This wasn't about that. So you have people that actually it was their job to find waste. So you have the inspector generals, and I don't know how many the total are. There's something like 30, 40, attached agencies, departments. And Trump actually fired most of them. These are people that have devoted that's their job, find waste, and they do. And then you have an agency, the General Accounting Office, that again, its purpose is to find waste, and they do. And they either, as I said, in the case of the inspector generals, they fired them. And in the case of the Government Accountability Office, to my knowledge, you go on their website, they have all sorts of reports saying, here's waste here, here's waste there. There's zero indication Elon Musk and his DOGE team ever even looked at that. So
yeah, I mean, look,
go ahead.
The idea that what happened in January, February, and March when there was this stampede to shrink the government was about waste is absolute nonsense. There was waste in the government. There's waste, as you said, in any major organization. But you have to, if you're serious about trimming it, you have to do it systematically. You have to look at where the waste is. You have to look at how best to get rid of duplication functions and so on. What you can't do is fire according to a quota. And that's what happened. You had these teenagers and software engineers in their teens and early 20s who Elon Musk hired, who had no idea about government, no idea about the relationship between executive and legislature. And they were literally told, you got to fire a certain percentage of your workers in each department. And they came in with their computers. They sort of essentially did a hack into the data systems. They worked out who the employers were who had least protection, not the employers who were least useful, but the employers who had least protection because they were newer onto the job. And they just sent out these emails en masse. So the CDC, for example, which I have two of my characters in American Carnage are CDC workers. They fired 800 CDC employees in one day. Their criteria for firing those 800 were people who had either newly been hired, maybe they were contractors who'd moved over to full-time employment, or they'd moved from one job to another. So they were listed as what was called probationary employees. And those hundreds of CDC workers, en masse, all in one day, got these form letters saying, you're being fired for poor performance. Well, most of those people weren't being fired for poor performance. Most of those people had sterling performance reviews. You fire 800 people for alleged poor performance, you ruin the rest of their careers, because every time they then apply for a job, especially a federal job, there's this scarlet letter. And that scarlet letter is basically a thing within the computer systems of the federal government saying fired for cause, which means it's going to be extremely difficult for those workers to then get rehired by the federal government. Now, the other thing that happens, of course, is you take away workers doing really important work, anti-smoking campaigns, preventive healthcare campaigns. You take those workers and you fire them. The end result isn't that you save money. You may save money in the short term, but the end result is you have a dilapidated public health system that's ever less capable of responding to risk. And then when you have a major health emergency, you have an epidemic outbreak, you have a pandemic, you have a rise in drug addiction, whatever it might be, you don't have the expertise in place to deal with it, and it costs much more money at the back end to try and repair the damage. If this was really about cost savings, you would have had careful, detailed projects and programs that took time to implement. This was never about cost saving. This was about eviscerating vital functions of the federal government, especially functions around public health, around workplace protection, around the environment. These were issues that had been in Trump's target list since his first administration. He came in with Russell Vogt and Project 2025 this year, and he had a sort of structure in place to implement that agenda. So the idea that this was cost saving, absolute nonsense. You're not going to find a serious economist anywhere on earth who says that the way the government was shredded over the last 6 months was an efficient or an effective way to generate cost savings.
I want to back up a little and talk about the probationary employees, because I think it's really important to emphasize what was going on here. So on the one hand, you have many cases, younger people, new workers, which you might say these are exactly the people you want to come in, because these are younger, energetic people. There's an idea, whether valid or not, that someone's been there 30 years or tired. They're just putting their time until retirement or whatever. Surely it's true in some cases, but these were new people. So again, they fired them because they're vulnerable as probationary. The other category, and you made a reference in passing, but I think it's really important for people to understand it. A lot of people are probationary employees because they actually got promoted. Yeah. So you have someone who applied for a higher position. They had good performance. They got promoted. They're now probationary in their new position. Elon Musk comes in there and goes, "You're fired."
That's right. And, you can become a probationary employee for a few different reasons. So one is that you're a young employee just coming into, and this is your first job. The second one is that you are an existing employee, you get promoted. The third one is that you were a contractor and you're doing a good enough job as a contractor that your agency says, well, you know what, we'd like to bring you on board full time. So you move over, it may be a lateral move, and you start getting government benefits, and you're in the pension system and everything else. But again, for that year, you're listed as a probationary employee. There's a whole other category, though, that we haven't mentioned, military veterans. The US government employs hundreds of thousands of military veterans who have retired from the military and are now in civilian jobs. And those veterans come in midlife in their 40s and 50s, and they also are listed as probationary employees. So a disproportionate number of the people that Elon Musk and his hatchet men, people with these absurd monikers like Big Balls and all these other sort of crazy monikers, these guys came in, they ran roughshod over due process, and they ended up firing really, really well-respected, high-functioning public service employees. And they did so by denigrating them, saying, well, they're all just bureaucrats, they're all just time punchers, they're all just people in low productivity jobs, and they should get out and get a more productive job in the private sector. Well, this is absolute nonsense. You had some of the most idealistic people in the country working in sectors like USAID, which I focused on in my book, a woman called Tally Lind, who'd been working for years and years on democracy projects in the Middle East, on anti-hunger projects, on all kinds of public health projects. And she gets fired in her 50s. Now, the idea that this is some pencil pusher, this is a woman who lived in Syria. This is a woman who lived in I believe, Pakistan, in some of the most dangerous hotspots on earth, doing vital work to project American soft power. And suddenly, she's now at the wrong end of this barrage of publicity and propaganda put together by Elon Musk, by DOGE, by Trump, by Vance, by Vote. These people should be ashamed of themselves. They took some of the most idealistic people in America and they vilified them. And they used a propaganda machine to convince tens of millions of Americans that this was the enemy within. And then they went out of their way to ruin the lives of these individuals. It is a shameful episode in American history.
Yeah, since you brought her up, why don't you tell us more about Tally Lind?
Yeah, so Tally Lind is someone that I encountered several months back, and she was fired she was put on what was called administrative leave within a couple of days of Trump being elected, being inaugurated. Tally Lind had DEI in her job title. So she was always going to be in Trump's sights because he was convinced that anything that was to do with diversity or anything that was to do with equality or anything that was to do with inclusion was definitionally bad. I mean, this is an insane agenda. In the most diverse country on earth, we are now being told that diversity is a cardinal sin. So Tally Lind is told to go home. She's not fired because she's not a probationary employee. She has about nearly 20 years of public sector work behind her. But she's told that she cannot work anymore. She cannot do these vital programs with USAID. So she goes home. She's fully paid for several months. And this is another reason that this idea that this was about cost savings is such nonsense. Many, many of the people who ultimately ended up losing their jobs for 3 to 6 months were put on administrative leave. In other words, they were paid a full salary to sit on their hands and do nothing. And Tally Lind knew this was an absurdity. She knew there was work to be done, vital work to be done. She's sitting at home every day. She's reading the news about catastrophes unfolding all over the world. She's reading the news about food that is being warehoused instead of being distributed because USAID has been told they can't distribute food. She's reading about anti-starvation measures, this thing called Plumpy Nut, which costs about 25 to 30 cents per dose, that's given to kids on the verge of dying from starvation. And you need to give them this for 6 to 8 weeks. And instead of the government distributing it, the government had warehoused it and was refusing to allow it to be distributed. She's reading about medical programs that are being discontinued, about drugs for AIDS and HIV patients that are being discontinued. And she's sitting there in stunned amazement, watching US soft power, this soft power that has been created for the last 60 to 80 years and that both parties have bought into, being eviscerated by Trump and by DOGE. And, she was completely stunned by what she was seeing. She'd never thought she would be in a situation where children in poor countries were being deliberately denied interventions that would stop them from starving to death at the whim of the world's richest man, Elon Musk, who had said that USAID must be fed to, quote, the wood chipper. Well, to me, this was an extraordinary story. And so I spent months and months and months talking with Tally Lind. And, she's a deeply humane person. She's a deeply educated person. She's a deeply idealistic person. She's worked in foreign service and in USAID for most of her working life. And now she's in her middle age. She loses her job. Her pension is eviscerated because if your job disappears and you have less than 20 years of public service in the Foreign Service, your pension is at a far lower level than it would be if you completed the 20 years. So she's in middle age. All of her financial calculuses are thrown out the window. And on a daily basis, she's reading news reports where Elon Musk, where Donald Trump, where all of this sort of conspiracists on the right are glorying in the demolishing of USAID. Now, again, to come back, USAID was founded by John Kennedy, but it was supported by Ronald Reagan and by Richard Nixon and by Mitch McConnell. I mean, this is a thing that historically has been recognized as one of the most important elements of the American projection of soft power around the world. And now it's gone. And that's part of the story that I tell through Tally Lind in the book that's coming out, the American Carnage book.
I want to get back to AID, in terms of what it does. Because again, we could, I'm sure, go through there seriously and find waste. And I'll bet there's reports we could find from the Inspector General, maybe the Government Accountability. I've not looked, but, it wouldn't surprise me that there's places where you could identify waste. But there's also been incredible benefits. I'll just mention the AIDS program that was actually started under George W. Bush. And that saved the lives of millions, perhaps tens of millions of people in sub-Saharan Africa at a trivial cost. It's less than, I think we're spending about 0.8, or we were spending about 0.8 of 1% of our budget on that, saving millions of lives. And, it seems to me, it's like, to give AIDS drugs. And again, this was a fantastic victory in terms of a number of activists like Jamie Love, who's done work on this issue his whole life, as a nonprofit, getting this going and getting the cost of AIDS drugs down. That, for $200, I think it's even less now, it might be 100 something, you could supply a year's dosage to someone that, otherwise would die of AIDS. And it's that simple. If you don't have the drugs, you die from it. And, they came in, and Musk, I really, to this day, I don't think he even knows what he did. Because he was saying no one died, and you just go, no, people died because they got AIDS, and without these drugs, they're dead. And,
there's a mathematical modeling unit at Boston University or Boston College, which has been studying the impact of the USAID rollback. And they have a ticker that's updated every day on the number of people they estimate are dying around the world. And by March or April of this year, so just 2 or 3 months in, they were already calculating that several 100,000 people, including, I think, a couple 100,000 children, had already died of a variety of diseases because of the USAID rollback. And these were diseases ranging from HIV/AIDS through to tuberculosis and malaria, through to emergent diseases like Ebola, and old diseases, which we've done a really good job of moving toward eradicating, like polio. And there was also diseases like diarrhea, and then chronic food shortages, malnutrition. All of this stuff was preventable. All of this stuff should not have happened. And, when I read the news every day and I see Trump railing about criminals and terrorists in America and the violence of Antifa and everything else, if you want to look at the single biggest act of American violence, probably since the Gulf War, or maybe even the Vietnam War, the single biggest act of state-supported violence is the rolling back of USAID, because it comes with a measurable body count. And we're not talking about 2, 3, 4 people. We're talking about hundreds of thousands in the short term, millions, maybe tens of millions over the next several decades. And it's a deliberate American policy now to deny all of these countries access to basic medical care and AIDS unless it's in America's financial self-interest. That's now the sort of metric. Unless you can sort of say, all right, this is in America's financial self-interest, you roll it back. Well, there's a sort of moral corrosion that's going on here. We're the richest, we're the most powerful country on earth, maybe in human history, and we are being governed by some of the richest people in America. This sort of new oligarchy of billionaires who make up Trump's cabinet or Trump's inner circle of advisors, the tech giants like Musk, Peter Thiel, and so on. And these richest people in the world have now made a policy decision that we as a country cannot afford to distribute 30-cent packages of plumpy nuts to starving children to rebuild their bodies so they don't die of starvation. That is an extreme extraordinary calculus, an extraordinary abnegation of moral responsibility. And you asked me at the beginning, why did I want to write this book? The more I did interviews with people like Tali Lind and with the other people that I was talking to, the more I realized that this wasn't just a story about a few people who'd lost their jobs in a sort of chaotic moment in American politics. This was about a fundamental reimagining of what the American story is. When the world's richest country turns its back on the poorest people on earth, or when the world's richest country turns its back on asylum seekers or on refugees and says we no longer have the resources or the services or the government infrastructure to provide, what does that tell the rest of the world about us? If we're projecting an image, what is that image that we're projecting? If we get rid, another person I focused on was somebody at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Well, that was set up to stop poor people being defrauded by rich, wealthy corporations, financial corporations. If we now turn around and eviscerate the functioning of the CFPB, we're essentially saying to the world, look, we're open for business. If you want to cheat people, if you want to pillage people, if you want to if you want to scam the poorest and most vulnerable, go right ahead and do it, because the American government's no longer going to invest resources to stop you. And again, that's a terrible message that we're projecting. It doesn't matter if you're Democrat, doesn't matter if you're a Republican. If you are concerned with the common good, surely you want the US government to be on the side of the little people rather than only on the side of the big people.
I was involved, having been in economic debates for a number of years now, back the debate around setting up the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And, there's actually, I agree, obviously, we want to be, to my view at least, on the side of the people being ripped off. But there's just a simple logic to this. If you have a transparent financial system, that's an efficient financial system, because what you're telling, the bank, the financial institution, don't try to rip people off, because we're going to catch you and we're going to make it expensive. So why don't you focus on trying to provide better services? You don't have to be a communist. It just, you're a bank, you're a lending agency, whatever it might be. What you're going to try to do is make the most money as possible. That's what they're in business for, right? They want to make it. So if they can make a lot of money by issuing deceptive loans, by having, perverse lending practices that end up putting people in bankruptcy, they will do that. But if you say no, you have to be transparent. That actually makes a more efficient system. And the only reason to nix something like the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which I remember Elon Musk had deleted, he thought that was very clever during the campaign. He decided this was going to be a target. Do you think it's good for them to commit fraud? I mean, that's basically what you're saying. And it is kind of, as you're saying, kind of incredible.
And building on that, when you said you don't have to be a communist to believe this, I'm sure you know this, that many of the institutions that are most predatory and many of the people who are most likely to be victimized are in red states where state regulatory systems are particularly weak. So if you go for payday lenders, which is sort of one of the ways that poor people in America have been particularly hurt over the last generation, most of the most exploitative lending goes on in states like Texas. So you have blue states, which over the last 10, 15, 20 years, New York, California, and so on, have built up pretty solid regulatory structures of their own and pretty solid rules and regulations around what you can and can't do. And then you have red states which haven't made those investments in their own regulations, don't want to make those investments in their own regulatory structures, and they sort of rely on the federal minimums. And when the federal government then steps in and says, look, we're no longer in the business of trying to stop fraud or trying to stop powerful institutions from preying on lower income Americans, that's a green light. And what it means is, especially in red states, lower income Americans are now peculiarly vulnerable and have peculiarly little recourse when things go wrong. And that's something that, again, whether you're Democrat, whether you're a Republican, I assume nobody wants large parts of the country to become a free-for-all where you can exploit and you can rip off poor people to your heart's delight, knowing that nobody's going to come in and try and stand in the way of that.
So let's get back to, the people you interviewed. One of the ones that struck me, Adrienne M., she didn't want to give her last name, which again says a lot, because, we know Trump is openly, he's malicious. He takes reprisals against people who criticize him. So it's totally understandable that some of the people he fired aren't anxious to have their names in your book or out in the media more generally. So she just gave her M initial as her last name. I don't even remember if that's correct. She might use the pseudonym as well. I can't recall. But anyhow, do you want to say a little bit? She worked for the CDC, the Center for Disease Control.
Yeah, absolutely. This is somebody who grew up in the Deep South, an African American woman who grew up in the Deep South, and her whole life she was pushing up against barriers. And she says to me, "Look, I'm now working at the CDC." She's a communications specialist. She was working at the CDC, and she gets put on administrative leave, and the department, the agency she's working in, gets sort of mothballed. And she was so full of heartbreak and anger at what had happened. And she said to me, there's this narrative that any black woman in government is only there because of DEI. And she felt very strongly that the people who were being fired were disproportionately African American. And I think if you look at the numbers, that's true, that historically public service has been a vehicle into entry into the middle class for African American workers for 2-3 generations at this point. And when you roll back government in the way that Musk and in the way that Trump has been doing, you disproportionately impact the black middle class. And there's a lot of employment data on that. There was a huge increase in African American female unemployment in the year 2025, just a massive spike and a massive decline, a massive decline in the number of African American women in the workforce. Well, that's tied in with the attack on public sector employees. And she said to me, "Look, I grew up in the Deep South. I had teachers who didn't believe in me because of the color of my skin. I would walk down the hallway in my high school and white students would jostle me and make snide comments about me. And now I'm, a professional in the CDC, and I have to listen every day to the government talking about DEI and unqualified African American workers." And she said to me, all of my confidence in the arc of progress is going away because I fear that we're seeing a sort of institutionalized re-implementation of racial discrimination. And that's an extraordinary thing in 2025 to have to grapple with, that we have a government now controlled by people who, if they can fire black workers in senior positions, are all too keen to do so. You've seen this with people who've been fired at the Library of Congress. We've seen top military officials fired. You can go down the list and you see this sort of very high profile dismantling of black leadership in the public sector. You look at the number of people the Senate's approved of Trump nominees. And when I last looked, it was only 2 out of more than 100 nominees who were African American. Well, this is shameful. Again, for 60 years, the federal government has made an effort to look and to be diverse and to reflect the diversity of the American population. And now we got a government that's doing everything it can to roll back that diversity. So, I talked with Adrienne M many, many times as I was writing this book, and her sense of betrayal, her sense of a government that was going off the rails, I found it so poignant and it stuck with me. And I also, the other thing, even factoring out the racial discourse, she was doing really, really important work in the public sector around public health. And when we eviscerate as a society, when we say, look, we're no longer going to invest in large parts of the CDC's functions, we're going to fire data gatherers, we're going to fire communications people who can communicate important public health information to the general public and to the medical profession. When we get rid of that layer of expertise, we leave the country extraordinarily vulnerable to public health emergencies. And, we're seeing this now. We have Kennedy in charge of the DHHS. We have an emergent measles epidemic on a scale we haven't seen in more than 30 years, and no federal organization to try to counter that. We have faith in vaccines being undermined by the people who are supposed to be putting forward a sensible message about vaccines. We have completely irresponsible claims being made around what's causing autism, stuff where the scientists just aren't backing up what Trump or what Kennedy are saying. Well, it took decades to make the CDC a global gold bar for information. And they're bulldozing that standard in a matter of months, and they're leaving this sort of pale, ghost-like shadow of what used to be the world's preeminent health organization. I have a cousin who's an infectious disease specialist, and we were talking about this a couple of months ago, and he said, look, if you want accurate information now on emergent diseases, may I make a suggestion? I said, sure. He said, look at the British public health sites or the Canadian public health sites, but the American one is no longer the gold bar. That's a startling change, and it was a completely unnecessary change, and it's all been driven by opportunistic propaganda politics.
Yeah, the cost of not being prepared, we don't have to go to ancient history. I mean, we had the COVID pandemic just 5 years ago, and the cost in terms of human lives, I think we were around 1.5 million here. I don't know what we sure over somewhere around 15, 20 million worldwide. And economically, it was in the trillions of dollars, the losses from having, large parts of the economy shut down for many months. And that wasn't, the crazy Democrats. This was under, people forget, it was Donald Trump who was president in 2020. And the fact was, most of the shutdown wasn't because the government forced it. It was because people didn't want to go to restaurants and movies and other places where they would get sick and, get their friends, their families sick. So that was the COVID. That wasn't the government. And again, could we have handled that better? Absolutely. Could we have prevented completely? Well, almost certainly not. But the being unprepared, being in a situation where you're unprepared altogether versus being in a situation where you do everything that's plausible, that's feasible, having cutting edge, research, testing, and monitoring, that makes a huge difference. So this isn't an abstract thing. We just saw it 5 years ago, and of course, other countries did much better than we did.
It's not abstract at all. And when you were talking earlier about USAID and the budget that we spend, and how it's a tiny percentage of our overall budget, there's been this concerted effort over the last 10, 15 years in right-wing media ecosystems to exaggerate how much America spends on foreign aid. And if you do opinion polling on it, you'll find that a significant percentage of Americans think that 1/4 of our budget, 25% of our budget, goes on overseas aid. It's actually it's less than 1%, and of that 1%, about half of it went to USAID. So in a given year, USAID was spending about $36 to $40 billion, which is a lot of money until you consider what a pandemic costs if it jumps the shark and goes all over the world. So you think of the savings that DOGE implemented or claimed to implement by cutting back on public health, the CDC domestically, USAID internationally, and then severing links with the World Health Organization. And you may save in any given year a few tens of billions of dollars. But if there's a pandemic, let's say something like Ebola gets loose in the way it almost did 10 years ago, and instead of USAID going in and trying to contain it, instead of CDC public health experts going out and trying to contain it, there's a void now because those agencies have been eviscerated. Well, if no other country steps in, if China doesn't have the resources, if the European Union is sidelined, if there's just a void in Africa and Ebola starts spreading uncontrolled, and then because of air travel spreads rapidly into America or Europe or wherever it might be, at that point, you're looking at a hemorrhagic fever pandemic that would cost the global economy, as you said, trillions and trillions of dollars, not to mention a vast number of human lives lost. It is such a sort of penny-wise, pound-foolish approach. The idea that you can save a few $1 billion by eviscerating vital public health and not have blowback, it doesn't make sense. If polio becomes resurgent again, which it could do because we're no longer funding vaccination movements against polio in large parts of the world. Again, polio is one of the most infectious diseases known to mankind. It's not going to stay in 1 or 2 or 3 countries. If there is a polio outbreak in an age of global air travel, that polio outbreak is going to spread all over the world. To bring it in, to contain it once it's been unleashed, again, you're looking at $1 trillion catastrophe. It makes literally no sense, the financial calculi that these guys are making. But it does make sense from a propaganda standpoint because they've spent years and years and years demonizing institutions like USAID and the CDC. And now this is payback to their base. Their base voted them back into power. And now whatever the damage it's causing, they're repaying their base by destroying this vital infrastructure and all the jobs that go with it and all of the lives that I'm talking about in American Carnage, all of the lives that are being ruined overseas by the lack of aid, all of that is the collateral damage that's at the tail end of this propaganda machine.
When you mentioned the budgeting, the reporting that it's 25 billion, 30 billion, and people see that it's a lot of money. This has been a pet peeve of mine with reporters for literally decades, and I literally don't have an explanation for this. I don't think there's a plausible explanation, or I'll just say I have not heard a plausible explanation because I've talked to reporters. I'm talking about people at the New York Times, Washington Post, NPR, and I say, why don't you put this down as a percent of the budget? It would take you 3 seconds. So if it, I don't care whether they write down 30 billion, that's fine if it makes you feel good, but no one knows what 30 billion means. And I've asked these people, I said, do you think, I recognize, I'm naming, what are considered the quality media outlets. So I understand they're much more educated audience, most of them college degrees, many of them advanced degrees. My proxy, here's my brother who's got a law degree. He also has a PhD in sociology. He doesn't know what 30 billion is. So, why can you not put that as a share of the budget? It takes you 3 seconds. You have you have a calculator, a spreadsheet. It takes you 3 seconds. It's about 0.4%. And then everyone can know, okay, that's how much it is in terms of my tax dollars or whatever program I think good should get the funding instead. You could still not like it. You're welcome not to like it, but just know how much it is. And for whatever reason, I can't get reporters to switch. Years ago, I'll shut up in a second. I got Margaret Sullivan, who was then the public editor of the New York Times, to write a wonderful piece making exactly this point. She got David Leonhardt, who was then the Washington editor of the Times, saying, yep, no one knows what these number means. We might as well just write really big number. He stole that from me, but that's fine. But then nothing changed. And I'm just going, so I don't know. I have no explanation for that. It's just incredibly frustrating.
I think, we as a species tend not to be very good at dealing with big numbers. We find it hard to contextualize, which is why when I've been a journalist more than 30 years, and I've always found that the most effective way I can communicate to an audience is human stories. I need the numbers. I mean, any good journalist needs the numbers, and you're right, they need to contextualize those numbers. But when I'm talking to audiences, and I hope I'll be talking to a lot of audiences about this book over the next few months, what I find is that the audiences respond most when they can understand the human impact. So when you talk about USAID, and Trump and Musk have demonized USAID as this sort of bloated, radical, lefty thing, and that's spending way too much money on things that it shouldn't be spending money on. And then you bring it down a notch and you say, all right, I'm going to introduce you to Tally Lind, and I'm going to tell you about her story and her dreams and what happened when those dreams were fractured. And I'm going to tell you about what happens on the ground in places like South Sudan or Haiti or wherever it might be when USAID is rolled back, the kids that die, the epidemics that are unleashed. When you actually personalize it that way, I find that audiences are, tend to be quite responsive. And when I was writing this book, one of the things that interested me was a number of the people I was writing about came from families that were actually quite conservative. So I have a woman in the book called Kelsey Hendricks, and she's blind. She's been blind since birth. And she was a contract specialist at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And it turned out that she came from a very conservative evangelical family in the South. And her family over the last few years has sort of largely bought into the rhetoric that the government is just this big bloated monster and that the best thing you could do would be to take a chainsaw to it. And, she's this very feisty young lady, and her dream had always been to work in an organization like NOAA. And she got her dream job first as a contractor, and then she moved over. And then she was fired as part of the early DOGE purges, again, because she was a contract specialist who'd moved over and was thus a probationary employee. And like the people I'd interviewed at the CDC and others, she also received this form letter saying you're being fired for poor performance. And again, it was nonsense. She'd had good performance reviews. She was, an absolutely idealistic public sector worker. But I was so sort of amazed when she started opening up about her family, because she said, look, even when I was fired and, I wanted my family to wrap themselves around me, She said, I got, my grandparents were still saying to me, well, maybe you should get a higher productivity job in the private sector. And this is a woman who's blind. This is a woman who has like overcome so many obstacles in life, and she's developed this niche job as a contract specialist at NOAA. And it's a job that she should have been really proud of, and it's a job her family should have been really proud of. And instead, she's running into this sort of barrage of propaganda that even her own family have bought into, that all government employees are somehow wasteful and they're doing nothing but sort of playing computer games and they're wasting taxpayer dollars. And it made me realize, there is so much work to be done if you want to have this conversation about, if you want to get beyond the stereotypes, if you want to have a conversation about what the public sector is and what public service is, or what is provided by public service. If you want people to understand what is provided by an organization like the NOAA, or you want people to understand what is provided by the fire service, you actually have to tell the stories. You got to interview people. You've got to say, all right, what are you doing? And they say, well, I'm a fire service person. I liaise with farmers about how to prevent fires in grasslands in the prairies, or whatever it might be. That was someone I interviewed who lost his job at the start of fire season. And when you tell those stories, that's, I think, when you start getting beyond the, blue-red divide. It's when people start responding as human beings and they start realizing, you know what, maybe we're losing something here when we shatter public service institutions. Maybe something very important gets lost in that process.
That's one of the things I think is most valuable about your book, is I have to say, I mean, it corresponds to my experience when I've dealt with public sector workers, both, as I mentioned, the statistical agencies. I'm an economist. I'm calling people at the Bureau of Labor Statistics at the Commerce Department. And they explain, how do you get this number? It always drives me nuts when people say they just make it up. I go, no, they're actually really careful. They're really transparent. They put a huge amount of effort into how they get that number. They don't pull it out of their rear. And the other thing, my wife and I like to hike. We go into the national parks, forests, national forests. When you go there and you talk to the people, I mean, you go, okay, well, what's a good trail to go on? But you have people that are really expert. They know, what animals are there, what the wildlife looks like, what the fauna looks like, what the history is in terms of fires. These are people who really love their jobs. They take it very seriously. And, to my view, we benefit enormously. I mean, it pained me. We lived near Grand Canyon for a number of years to see, large chunks of that just burned down. Again, I can't speak to whether it could have been prevented or not, but it was just a real tragedy. And you do have people who are very committed to try to, protect, our national parks, our wildlife. And, for as I say, it's just painful to see Musk and Trump running around denigrating these people like they're criminals. It was infuriating.
Yeah, I mean, look, the national park is another example where it's quite easy to sort of talk to people across the political divide, because they're one of America's most beloved institutions, and tens, if not hundreds of millions of visitors go to the national parks every year. And they come from blue states and they come from red states, and some of them like camping and some of them like just going on a tour. But whatever it might be, it's an institution that's a core part of what we think of when we think of America. When tourists come to America, one of the things bringing them in is the spectacular nature of the American National Park System, these wild, wild areas. Well, if you fire a huge percentage of the national park staff, it means the trails aren't maintained. It means the bathrooms and the campsites aren't maintained. It means if somebody gets in trouble when they're, hiking up a mountain, or they're climbing a rock, or whatever it might be, that the rescue teams aren't in place. As you said about the fires, it makes it far more likely that critical amounts of the acreage of these national parks will burn down in fire season. That at every level, if you take out that many national park staff, you weaken the system and nobody wins. Well, I guess some people win, because then you can sort of open up public lands to private drilling and everything else. So maybe the oil industry wins, maybe the mining industry wins, or the rare earth metals industry wins. But ordinary Americans and ordinary tourists lose. And that's a very sort of straightforward calculus, that if you don't have a national park staff in place, visitors to those national parks are going to have a truncated experience. But, it's not just the national park. One of the people in my book is a young man who works for the IRS, and he answers telephones 8 hours a day. And it's not a glamorous job. It's not a particularly well-paying job, But it's kind of important because if you're paying taxes and you have a problem, you've been given a bill you don't understand, or you need to get a refund that hasn't been issued, or whatever it might be, it's pretty critically important that if you phone the IRS, you actually get to talk to someone. Well, what happened in February, March, and April was a huge number of IRS employees were put on administrative leave. They weren't fired straight away. They were just told they couldn't work anymore. So they're paid to do nothing, while the phone wait times for anyone who's trying to call into the IRS goes through the roof. And the same story happened with the Veterans Affairs Administration and the Social Security Administration and Medicare, that if you take a critical number of the frontline people who are interacting with the public on a daily basis and you tell them they can't work for whatever reasons, to fulfill Project 25's dream of a smaller government, to fulfill Elon Musk's sort of egomania, whatever the reasons, if you shrink government that quickly and that unsystematically, you hurt the public very, very badly. And we started seeing that. We started seeing the wait times for calls to the IRS go from, minutes to hours. Same thing for all these other organizations. Well, that's a story that I tell in American Carnage. If you want to understand what America looks like at the back end of all this, you want to understand the sort of waste landscape that we're creating, read the stories of people like that IRS worker, and it will give you a sense of the sheer chaos of what's been unleashed since January 2025.
Yeah, well, that's quite a story, and probably a good place to wrap up here. But anyhow, thanks for joining us. I encourage people to get the book. I guess it's still a couple months out till it's going to be available.
Well, it depends. It's published by All Books, and if you order it off All Books' website, I think it's actually being pre-released in the next few weeks. If you order it off Amazon or go into your local bookseller, its official release date is January 20th, the first anniversary of Trump's inauguration. But it's circulating.
Good timing. So, all right. Well, thanks a lot for joining us, Sasha. And I enjoyed reading the book, and I encourage people to look at it. So, thank you.
Pleasure, Dean. Thanks so much for having me on.
If you like what you just saw, please help us out by liking us and subscribing. Thank you.